Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. In Andrea de Leon's own words, she is a multidisciplinary artist that uses elements of light, equilibrium, optics, and psychology in order to explore a quantum neuroses. Due to the nature of making the work, the exchange of heat and energy inherently embeds itself within the process and creates a dynamic, cerebral landscape, often causing a paradox where it creates mass with negative space. The work takes a metaphysical approach to reveal something about the viewer, ultimately grasping to understand what makes us human. In the same way as her glass and metal work, Dre's knives and jewelry take on a personality and mind of their own as she pushes into an unexplored universe of thought through physical medium. We discuss a lot of the esoteric nature of art and creativity and how thought provokes and evokes. Andrea, it's a pleasure to have you on the Good Old Blades podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aaron.
Yeah. I want you to go through, I guess, well, let me back up. I started, I guess, my adventure through your work a few years ago, actually. And what interested me about it wasn't necessarily your knife making per se, but what you were doing inside of jewelry and glass. And it so happens that I don't know whether it was like the Instagram algorithm or what, where I stumbled upon your profile and everything. But after I got into knives more deeply, and then more recently was talking to Steve Schwarzer about artists and whatnot, he said to talk with you. And so I'm like, oh, you know her? Like, that's pretty cool. And I want to understand some of the connection between Steve and you, but I really kind of want to dig a little bit more into the distant past, because you have 11 or so years on Instagram of stacked activities and stuff. And I just kind of want to know, like, what got you into crafts and art, and what was your early development into that first, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Okay, sounds good. Honestly, it was a little mix. I didn't realize I was just a deep-rooted pyromaniac until after I was like in the thick of it. But I pursued art. I was always attracted to design. And actually started out in architecture. So I studied architecture at SCAD for about a year and dabbled in industrial design, and saw that the program at UT, their art program was pretty broad, and it didn't corner you in one thing for 4 years. And that was really attractive to me, because at then I was like very still confused about what really like my career would be, and I like cared about it so much, but it didn't want to be limited or cornered. I feel like that's been my MO my whole life. Like, if someone's trying to define me, I try to, the minute you tell me I'm like stuck in this one place, I'm going to try to get out of it. So and through that program, I started getting educated about conceptual art, which definitely pleased my philosophical brain. And in my mind, it was a pure pursuit to do something so human, so innately psychologically human. Like, humans are the only ones that really have the capacity to transform other objects through cognition, like shifts in their cognition, like that. For example, like that these ready-made objects, that toilet is no longer a toilet, it's a fountain, right? Or and that's a Duchamp piece, but that kind of mindset is uniquely human. And so I started dabbling into more psychology, and I was making a lot of sculptures based on artificial intelligence, and like why computers have this map that mimics a certain, like the way a human brain functions, and tying that with the physical world around me that was more metaphysical, more like exploring quantum physics, like basically just exploring these ideas that were always weighing really heavy on me, through like establishing a relationship with the material. So that led me to really hone in on jewelry, metalsmithing. That was my main focus in undergrad, because there's no way around it. You have to know the inherent properties of these non-ferrous metals in order to get them to do what you want them to do. Not only that, but it's extremely challenging and everything has to be super precise. But it's mostly like, I feel more like a chemist when I'm in the jewelry studio than an artist. Most just because of the nuances and like why things have to operate. So that knowledge becomes then inductive with any other material. Like it's actually very similar to glass in that way. How it wants to be heated, the stress that's in there, how you weld it, things like that, right? So that just kind of, that momentum kept me pursuing these different crafts. It's a
Yeah, that makes
long-winded
sense.
answer, but yeah.
No, hey, listen. The less that people have to listen to me, the better. But I'm interested in that because, even inside the concepts of jewelry, because I had done an apprenticeship with a jeweler here, and I would always been into metal stuff. I would say, just being like a country bumpkin and farming equipment and things like that. It was just like, you
Mhm.
made the tools that you used all the time, right? And when I moved down to Texas, I did a jewelry apprenticeship, and because of a lot of factors and with the economy, it just became very expensive to operate in the gold and platinum and rhodium and all those things. It was just like super expensive.
Yeah.
It was like I can't do this on a starting budget. Whereas
Yeah.
this,
Overhead is high.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I did some silver work for a while, but the economy wasn't there because people, when they're looking for jewelry, they're really looking for, well, in this custom jewelry market that we were in when I was apprenticing, the eye was more for gold and stone setting and things like that, but not
Hmm.
everybody had the funds for it. So it was definitely a luxury purchase. And so it was just like very constrained. And so I got kind of gravitated away from that and was just working on this IT career thing in cybersecurity. And then I was like, I still really like manipulating metal, and in a way that I have some constraints. And so I got into knife making. But in addition, with like all of the very cerebral, like figuring out what you're like, how metal, especially non-ferrous metals operate and what constraints there are. There's also an exceptional amount of technical knowledge that you have to have on how to manipulate fire and how to cast things and how to set things and all that stuff. So, I mean, was that portion interesting to you more than the science and I guess natural properties of metalwork, or kind of like what did you gravitate more towards?
I think it was like parallel, to be honest with you. When I first walked in there and saw like the more experienced people with like those big torches, I'm like, I cannot wait to be like doing that. I wonder what they're doing. Not only that, I don't know if you've ever like, I know there's like the fine jewelry world, and then there's like snag, the art metals world, which is like things get so weird. And I was just fascinated with like the conceptual jewelry that's like not necessarily everyday wear, that people were coming up with. But to answer your question, as I was just addicted to learning more of the techniques. And I think that's something that also kept my interest for so long, was the fact that they're under the umbrella of jewelry fabrication. You're not limited to just using non-ferrous metals. You can use like wood, other things. I've seen people use chocolate. Like, it's kind of wild. And so you're not necessarily constrained. And at the same time, there's all these umbrellas that on their own take a lifetime to master, like stone setting, engraving, enameling, right? Casting. So, in that sense, it's like, when would I use each process, right? Like, when is the appropriate thing? Like, why would I cast this instead of fabricate it, and things like that, where you learn to be more efficient, or just tune into like what processes you enjoy. Like, I love the way chainmail looks, but I mean, you couldn't pay me enough to do it. Like, I don't think I'd have the patience for it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, I don't know if you've ever like raised a vessel out of sheet, but I wish I had the time to do that kind of stuff now. It's more of like a labor intensive old school process, but the way you have to forge metal and like control its thickness so it doesn't like blow out and things like that are all. I mean, not only did I enjoy hammering like the hell out of some metal, just it was very primitive, but at the same time, like, you had to pay attention to when it was work hardening and when to anneal it, and like predict how far it's going to stretch, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And for as much as I had done in jewelry, I realized that I really just kind of scratched the surface on it, because I mean, there's so much. There's so many different things. Like we dabbled in horology, being able to do some watch repairs and whatnot. But for larger jobs with mechanisms and things, we always had a guy that was we sent them off to. So it's like we kind of diagnosed what the problem was, and then to get it fixed, if it wasn't just being able to find and replace a part, but something had to be made or whatever, that's always something that, you had to give estimates on and then talk to the guy who actually knew what he was talking about with, rebuilding watches and things. And,
Horology's fascinating.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a dying art, but actually the university that I teach at, the jewelry program was called horology, for that. So I mean, I'm glad I work for like a trade school workforce thing. But yeah, it's super cool. To I mean, that's a whole other level, and like, you work under a microscope the whole time and all that jazz. So
Yeah. I think, talking about kind of like jewelry, well, I think that we could probably argue that there's a lot of physical art forms like metal and ceramics and glass and things like that that really are kind of alchemy. At the same time that, if you study them in a scientific way, they make sense and you can add context to it. But really, the masters, they just flow through that kind of like it's understood, like they're just channeling some type of ancestral knowledge in order to get to where they are. And like an example of that is in this fine jewelry space that I operated in. You use kind of modern equipment and whatnot, but we had a guy who had been really great friends with the master jeweler, and his name was Ramon, and he was from El Salvador. And so he learned jewelry making from El Salvador, and a lot of the same concepts that we were doing with modern casting and whatnot, he would also educate me on the old way of doing things, like throwing it in a sling and getting the
yeah.
like aqua
I tell people about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're like,
Yeah.
people will just like sling this above their heads when they don't have a casting machine.
Yeah. Well,
It's
I think that that's cool though, because expression through those mediums in a lot of ways doesn't have to be a super expensive thing. Like, I feel in some ways like knife making, you have to have all of this equipment in order to be a I don't know, like the modern the modern knife maker. Like everybody expects that you have a 2x72 and everything like that, but there are like lots of ways to manipulate materials where you don't have to have super complex equipment to do those things and still produce really great pieces of works. You know.
I definitely agree. My metalsmithing teacher in undergrad was very old school, and she wouldn't let us even touch a power tool or flex shaft until after like the second or third semester. Just and I'm really grateful for that because I didn't have access to all the fancy equipment when I left there, so I knew how to do everything despite, not having. So I make a point to show my students like this is what you do when you don't have that tool. But if you go work for someone, they're most likely going to use this buffing tool or whatever it is, this power tool, and I want you to be competent around it, right? So just to be experienced. So I like to show both methods. But I mean, having all the tools is helpful. It's just like more tools in your arsenal to be working efficiently. But you're right, it's not necessary. I see some really magnificent work with like bare minimum. I mean, I lived in Mexico for high school. My whole family's from there. I see it all the time. Like they, it's still very third world in some parts, and these workshops don't have much. It's pretty mind blowing what they can do. So yeah, it just takes ingenuity. But I actually love getting to the point where I can like MacGyver a solution to anything, right? Um, to be able to make something happen. But it takes a minute to get there. I remember it wasn't like always there. The concept of making your own tool was like intimidating until you're just thrown in the deep end and you just kind of have to come up with these solutions on your own. And I mean, over time, you collect all these tools, right? Um, but yeah, I think you're totally right. It's not necessary always.
Yeah. It's kind of funny too that in making things, tool making sometimes fits somewhere farther down the line of mastery, in the human space. But if we think about it, like monkeys do that as a way of life, in order to crack nuts or get bugs out or things like that. Like it's like uh, that process of making tools in the chimp space is like some of the first things that you do, and we wait until later on in the evolution, like when we figure out how basic things work, then we make tools.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. I've noticed that too whenever I watch, these nature documentaries. Like, we are definitely not the only ones that use tools. I even think this is speculation, of course, but one of the first knife making books I had argued that a knife was the first thing that we made, like a flint, right? As humans. That's of course speculative, but it would make sense, right? And uh, that keep capacity I feel is really fascinating because like we're able to engineer telescopes like that are super complex when we like put our minds to it, right? So I think that ingenuity is somewhat, it's like unique and rare sometimes. I feel especially now that everything's kind of given to you on a silver platter and things are a little easier, so that level of ingenuity is left to a very few. Um, but yeah, I think mostly it's the people that just have no choice but to like invent a way to do it. That's my favorite thing, is to go visit other people's shops to see how they're set up, and it fascinates me how different approaches can result in the same thing. I'm like, okay, as long as it works, that's definitely my philosophy. Doesn't matter how you do it as long as you're safe and effective, right? I know other people that are a lot more, what's the word, pretentious about it, or like this is the way
Yeah.
or it's incorrect. Um, and like I get that, and I will like to respect tradition, but I'm all about you have to know the rules before you break them.
Yeah. Or don't understand what the rules are and then break them continuously, and then you just come up with a way that works independent of rules.
Yeah, I don't know if this happened to you, but I find that I was a lot ballsier with knife making when I didn't know what I was doing. Well, when I was not didn't know how things were really gonna work, right? If I tried something. And uh, how about you? Were you like, are you more daring now than you were before?
No, I would say maybe in the sense that there are some thoughts that I will explore through the knife medium, right? But the more I've gotten, I guess, indoctrinated into things, the more I think that I've also dealt with some of the psychological side steps that happen as part of like creativity. Like when you think like this is what I'm known for, or this is what I'm good at, this is what sells, or this is what is I know, right? You do kind of naturally paint yourself into a box. And when I get into that space, I always have like this existential crisis. And I've had that many times in knife making where I'm like, I
Yes.
hate myself. I hate where I'm at right now. And I got to like figure out
Yes.
some way to get out of it.
Yeah, I feel you 100%. Which is why I'm grateful that I have these different mediums to fall back on for that. And then I miss knife making and I end up kind of getting really bullheaded and just making a knife I want to make, right? Like I want to do like this over the top and then it gets me excited again and then I'll do the bread and butter stuff, right? But yeah, I understand that aspect of like people are expecting this of me and I need to like do that, but then I also realize um I don't think people care that much. I'm not sure. Like it's kind of this yeah, outside pressure you put on yourself, which is can be a good thing to keep the discipline. That's I feel like that's something that's not often talked about. Is the discipline to get in your shop and make stuff. But um, yeah, I think it's also good to get a little punk rock every once in a while,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah. And, I think that's the thing is, I like art really does imitate life in a lot of ways because if I take what I experience inside of knife making, and I remove knives and replace it with some other word than knife making, I find that there's actually a lot of things like if you take like all the deep darks of like how you feel in a medium, right? And then you replace that thing with some aspect of life, you find that there are a lot of things that are corollaries inside of anything that you're expressing yourself with. It could be like the relationships you have with your family or your significant other, or society in general and things, or the way that you perceive, mirror, project yourself, right? So kind of like going back to that kind of idea of what you're talking about with these different mediums and the cerebral side of things, I constantly pull from that. Like I realize just how much knives are philosophical, but then if I take that out and replace it with jewelry, or in the case where I see the way that you express yourself in your glass and other work, I could see the same thing or theme repeating itself. And it's just this idea, I guess, of taking the world and cracking it open and trying to figure out a piece of it through this one medium, if all that makes sense.
That is exactly right. I think I even have that in my artist statement to an extent. Um, like it is. I think the words I use is a quantum neurosis. Like I'm really it's Newton's second law in its purest form. I am reacting to a thing in front of me, and it's having an equal and opposite reaction to my, I don't know, stimulus, to my kinetic energy or potential energy, right? For example, forging a blade, there's nothing more like physical than that idea is perfect in that, like, my kinetic energy is being like changing the mass of this object, right? And then I am responding to its change, and it's a back and forth, and in a way it gives me a sense of place, like I can understand the world around me. Not only that, like, through my manipulation, like, I can control whatever is happening on my bench most of the time, right? Not always, but most. But I can't control like all the crazy stuff that's going on outside in the bigger scheme of the world, right? So in it, I am constantly chasing this flow state where I can make sense of certain very abstract objects, even how we relate to each other, or this. I mean, I'm sure you saw a lot of the Rorschach kind of things, right? Where we all see different things in the same object. Like, I'm really fascinated by that. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a powerful thing, and so yeah, it doesn't matter if it's jewelry or clay, or I do notice that it's always requiring some kind of chemical, atomical change at some point in the process, or in anything that I do. Doesn't matter what the material is, like, there's always that factor, which I found interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I each medium. Well, I mean, even thinking about it in jewelry, every metal has a different way that it responds, and that's actually something I was forced to come to terms with in my apprenticeship. Was that the first thing that they did, it was like, okay, you're gonna buff everything. Like, so we all the like the bitch work basically is what. Yeah,
Finishers, yeah.
right. I mean, yeah, you want to call it something like it's all
Yeah, it
it's
is bitch work,
yeah.
yeah. You're
And
gonna be polishing forever.
yeah,
Yep.
polishing and cleaning and figuring out, and like when I first started on, I don't know why I didn't think of it, because I knew about like heat conductors and whatnot for like forever, right? But I'm sitting
Hmm.
there and like buffing these things, and and they're just sitting there waiting for me, that thing to heat up super quick and then burn my fingers. And I'm like, you knew that was going to happen. Why'd you just tell me like to watch my fingers, right? But like gold and platinum and silver, they all kind of have a little bit different touch, and you don't realize that until
Hmm.
your fingers are calloused enough, where you're desensitized enough to figure out that they just have a little bit of a different soul, each one of those things.
Yeah, there's a different timing. Yeah, silver especially, I warn my students, I actually preempt them to quench before it even gets hot, because it's gonna sneak up on you.
Yeah, well,
Um,
mine did not. They just let me burn everything and destroy stuff, and watch and laugh. It's like they were the masters of chaos. It seemed.
I can't help it. I do giggle whenever, a ring gets sucked into the buffer, because we've all been there, right? And just ricochets everywhere. Um, I don't know. It's just it's a humbling thing, I think, especially working with glass, but at each medium, doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, will remind you that, like, it's Murphy's Law is always there. And so it kind of helps if you check your ego at the door. And in that way, it kind of keeps you grounded, I guess. Like, there's a lot of the times where that ego and like drive and determination will like make you do something you thought was impossible. But like, a lot of the times it'll just, like you said, you'll have these existential crises where, like, what am I even doing? like, why am I obsessing over this thing? And I did it yesterday, why can't I do it today? But I feel like a lot of what I do, especially knife making, has um, like forced me to tune in to where I'm at that day. Like if I have to do any finish grinds, and I know it's going to be a belt finish, which is it depends on what it is, right? But if I'm not in that mental space where I can like hyper focus, I will do leather work or something else, because you just kind of know you're gonna like make more work for yourself later on down the road, mess something up. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Do you do stuff like that where you're like, I don't know about this. I have to do this, but I think I'm gonna do something else.
Yeah, no, all the time. I mean, I think the headspace that you're in really kind of determines whether it's a positive experience or not. I've never done psychedelics, but I know from a lot of friends and stuff who have that say, if you're going to get into it in a session or whatever, that you need to be in the right frame of mind, because there's things that will like definitely affect your trip, right? and
Yeah, it'll amplify it.
yeah, and
Yeah.
in the same way, but in the same way, like you're thinking about how you manipulate something, and the safety factor, and what your intended outcome is. And there's certain things that I just don't do, like I'm not in the shop when I'm drinking anything, and I'm not in the shop when I'm tired. And I've managed to stay pretty safe from getting like losing digits or getting real hurt. But I've also learned that from experience, where I'll be like tired or not in the right headspace, and then I'll just totally botch something that I knew that I had really well understood, but it changes the variables way too much, and then I just end up screwing something up. So like when I enter that space, I have to treat it with a little bit of reverence and respect. And so that means like making
Yes.
sure that I'm in the right space. But that in and of itself is kind of like anxiety driven in some ways, because like what you feel like sometimes, like what if I am not going to be in this space for a while, or you're like, I have this thing that I'm trying to get done and it's taking me a while to get into this frame of
There's a
mind.
deadline,
Yeah.
yeah. Or I'm in a funk or whatever. Yeah, that's a good point. I for me, it forced me to learn to manage my time better. Like nothing like jewelry, like maybe because the process, you can't just whip out the processes will not allow you to just cram the last night for, a critique you have the next day. Like that's just not gonna fucking happen. Like, and so that in that sense, even though that's where that discipline I mentioned earlier comes in. Like I'm gonna go into the shop even though I don't really feel like it, because I want to allow time for those bad days to happen, or those days where I'm like off my game, or like the juju's not there, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. Like psychologically, it's definitely like the attitude when I step up to the grinder, when I'm like, yeah, this is gonna be fun. I can't wait just to get all these knocked out, or like, ugh, this is a drag. Like I have to be so perfect on this, and um, something like that that's kind of hanging over my head. It definitely um, makes the outcome, or affects the outcome for me. I feel.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I think that, like as in life and as in art or whatever, self-esteem is kind of one of those weird things that I think when you kind of know what your core tenets are and what that value system is, then
Yeah.
then self-confidence is bred from there, right? And when you have
Yeah.
self-confidence, usually the things that you do, it's easier it's easier for you to accept failure when you're self-confident. because in some ways, like, you have this like cycle that goes through where you screw something up because you're self-confident, but then you're like, okay, well, I can just make it real quick, and you just kind of like move on. But when you kind of regress back into that, I just don't know, like, grinding blades is one example, where I've done it, and I've had friends who've done it, where you just, one day you're in the shop and then everything just seems off, like you don't know how to hand grind
Yeah,
anything.
exactly.
And I'm just
Uh-huh.
like, okay, well then break it up, do something else, like taper tangs, or like you mentioned about doing
Yeah.
leather work or whatever. Like, you can find ways to still do something that breaks that cycle of failure, right? Where I
Yeah,
can't,
I agree with
yeah,
you.
like you can do
Yeah, like
something that is successful and that you get done and then you feel like it's a checkbox.
for sure. I was really grateful. My glass mentor in Chicago was very hyper aware of that phenomenon, that like some days are just bad glass days, and he would just like tell me to stop and go, like, put me on a different task entirely, because there's just some days, and that, I mean, you're not a robot. Like, some days, I don't know, there's something's in the air, whatever. Like, you might be in a good mood and like wanting to do this thing, but sometimes, I think that's like another factor that keeps it interesting for me, right? I feel like that the unpredictability is like, it's a drag, but it's also attractive. I don't know if that makes
Yeah, no,
sense.
no, yeah, it does. Well, and I'm reminded, I think that, okay, speaking about metaphysics, right? Like, I don't think that we really understand as much as we think we do about like the universe at large, right?
Right.
But there are some things that I think we can argue that there's some like outside force at play. Like, for instance, some days we wouldn't cast on certain days, and it's because like the old timers in the shop and whatnot knew that there was a certain like humidity and temperature that made casting harder because of the plaster, right? It made it harder
Right.
than others. And it's like, whether it's their equipment or whether it's like being able to control the environment, like there were certain things that made the casts like worse, right?
There's so many variables.
Yeah. Like, yeah, I mean, and you could probably can like break it down into different scientific things, but it's no different than in violin making. Like, early on, I was planning on getting into a luthier apprenticeship and making violins, right?
Hmm.
And the varnish that you put on violins usually happens at like wherever you're at locale wise, it happens during a certain season, because the humidity and temperature has to be right. Otherwise, the varnish can like take forever to cure, and it means that you can't get the other layers on correctly, and like the entire sanding process and all those things are affected in it. So like the ephemeral beauty of an instrument in its varnish is intrinsic to the seasons of life. And you got to just kind of know when things work and when things don't. And that's a lot of trial and error, usually.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, Murphy's Law is always a thing. I mean, I even tell my students sometimes, like, to lower their expectations. They'll spend like weeks carving a project, and like, you can do everything right, and sometimes like the stars can be aligned and things will still go wrong, like, for no reason or apparent reason, right? Um so uh it's just something that I find fascinating, that I've been doing this for so long, and I still am constantly surprised, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's what happens when that thing did the thing, or this is a new one, or I haven't seen that before, or whatever. It's I mean, especially helpful being in a school full of students, right?
Yeah.
Being exposed to, like, a ton of different opportunities for failure. Um, but I don't know, like, I have a lot of great students with good attitudes, and they just, I kind of warn them at the beginning, just, if they're expecting instant gratification that they're in the wrong department and they should drop out. Like, it's just, it's harder than it seems. And now a lot of them are just starting and are realizing like the labor involved in it. For example, polishing sometimes takes just as long as making the actual piece. um
Yeah, no doubt.
so yeah.
Well, and I'm interested too in like the different personas that pursue different things in life, right? Because like for me, I'm definitely more of like a realist to contrarian. I don't like, yeah, sometimes I'm pessimistic, right? But I sit in this weird quadrant where I'm just kind of like, things are what they are. And if you try hard enough, you can figure them out. But I also think that maybe there's like some cosmic disorder that makes it funny that you fail, right? And and there's other
I
people.
agree. I would cheers you to that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, but it's funny though, because there's some people that I think that they go through the same kind of like emotional ups and downs, but they only remember the things that are the positives, right? They're the positive people. And you're like, so like they might say that they're lucky, but I'm like, dude, did you not see like all the landmines that you almost got blown up by? And they're like, dude, no, I see all the landmines that I didn't get blown up by because, I'm lucky. And I'm like, okay, well, we just like see things just a little bit differently.
Right. Luck had to do with it.
Yeah. I mean, whatever that case may be. I mean, I think that like
Yeah.
it's difficult sometimes. I think too, like when you're trying to be motivated. You're talking about discipline.
Oh, for sure. That's why I'm like, I'm a pessimist and extremely cynical. So I think what my craft is, it aligns with me because I hope for the best and expect the worst. Especially, again, with like a high failure rate in glass, like you just know, like it's just not, you'll spend all this time, money, energy, sweat into this thing that will break at the very last second. And you just kind of accept, like, okay, now that I learned, like I knew better not to do that thing and I did it anyway. And that's what happened, of course. Okay, so next one is going to be, and so you learn not to become super attached and it's more about the process. But like you're right, it takes I find it also interesting to see the different personalities that I get drawn to. I think knife making is has, and it might not be all the way, but I think every knife maker I know is a contrarian to a certain point. I think you kind of have to be. I think Jeff Fader said this at the very end of the podcast I had with like uh, Joshua Prince and Leah Arapach and Keith Decent, where the stuff that we do defies all logic, but we're addicted and you're gonna do it anyway. Um, so yeah, I see people from all different like. There's some like really great like older retired ladies that like they're there all the time. They have the most amazing work ethic. And there's even like these really young Gen Z people that are just really fascinated by the process. It's really hard to find someone there that doesn't have a work ethic, and I'm grateful to be working somewhere where everyone that's there wants to be there. Um, so it's a little different than like working at like a state school, for example, where it's a bunch of freshmen and they're just partying all the time and don't care about class or something like that, right? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. And I don't know. There's a lot to chew on that. I don't. It's interesting to me too because for those who are like neurotic about things, it seems like the analogy is like if you're allergic to cats, you probably shouldn't make a living raising cats, right? And and if you have certain types of tendencies towards anxiety or self-doubt or whatever, like choosing a medium that basically just intrinsically expresses that might not seem that logical. But I think that when you when you look at things and you're very cerebral about it, you have to force yourself and challenge yourself. Otherwise, you never really crack that nut. That is that thing that always just sits in the back of your brain. Like, can this happen? Will this happen? Why does this happen? You know, the big question mark around life and things. And I think it's interesting in knife making, but then in all these other mediums, because like I really just like to talk to people who have a desire to create things, right? And then we talk about why that's knives. But really, arguably, a lot of knife makers could be really great makers in other spaces. And it's just, they choose knives for one reason or another, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think like well, you mentioned self-esteem, and uh, I I think that definitely has something to do with it. It's not the first time I mention it, but the pursuit of making things was what started giving me some confidence. So like growing up, especially as like a young girl, like when all the magazines and stuff were out, it's just you're taught that you're only worth how pretty you are. And I know that's like an ephemeral thing. So, and like I was also, I never really achieved true satisfaction until I poured blood, sweat, and tears into making something. And that was like the first time it was like this weird relief, right? So and then all of a sudden I just like felt like it was my job to know every single process in order to convey the message that I was trying to give to the viewer as an artist, right? Like I saw a lot. This is just taking inspiration from all the other sculptors and people that were doing crazy installations that I knew. Like they learned how to do this one thing because it was part of giving the message to the public. So, or just like expressing this one idea. And so that's kind of like why I was like, oh, I need to know like all of the things. Um, I need to know how to do this, that, or the other. The knives just kind of, I wanted to try it, and then it just, people kept responding to them, so I still did it. So there was that momentum, but it was also pretty addictive because it was like, then I learned about this or that or the other, like this process, and I wanted to try it. And I ultimately always use some kind of form of traditional metalsmithing in my pieces. And I think that comes from me being told in art school that jewelry or metalsmithing wasn't gallery worthy. And so I would always sneak some kind of technique in my pieces that were in a gallery. Just to prove a point, I guess.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I think going back to your comment about well, I'm not a girl, so I don't really know. I mean, I'm not very attractive like comparison to girls either. It's not like what I think about in that concept is that in society and as it relates to the sexes and whatnot, people have different paradigms that they encounter through different stages, right? So, like, if you're born with good looks and everything, and you're female, it tends to be that you're seen only for those things, right?
Life is just easier for you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the allegation, right?
Yeah.
But and if you're I guess good looking and a guy, it's the same thing. But it's kind of like this weird flip flop, right? When you're young and you're traditionally viable as a mate or pretty or whatever, then your stock is high. And as a guy, if you don't have anything, your stock's pretty low. But then as time goes on and, people age, typically guys, for whatever reason, will be able to figure out ways to be like, financially viable or strong or something. And their stock goes up later on in life. And then, girls, it seems like if, you get older or whatever, and people marginalize your looks and your stock goes down. And it's this weird thing where it's like, I think if you like strip that away, right? This like weird,
Uh-huh.
weird dynamic of what's societally attractive, and you're able to focus on the things that actually matter, like intelligence and your ability to affect change or whatever. That those things to me seem way more attractive, and I think that they're the core psychological principles that build that self-esteem, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I knew that that was a losing battle if I just put all my eggs in that basket, because it's going to fade. Like, doesn't matter, I mean, how it was or whatever. Like, I wanted to have something to offer beyond that. Um and like mostly just prove it to myself more than anyone that I could do this thing. I could, and that contrarian side of me, of course, and like, tell me I can't weld. Like, and I'm not saying that I'm the perfect welder, but like if someone tells me I can't do something, I'm gonna there was a lot of things in my early 20s that drove, like, my motivation was through spite, and it got me to places that I didn't even think I could go, which is, I feel like, a good thing. um but yeah, I think that's mostly what I try to pass on and preach. That's why I like teaching, um because it's just giving this kind of empowerment to other people. Like, you are worth more than that. You are capable of doing this, and the skills you're learning now, no one can take away from you. Like, that's just in your brain and your self now. You know how to do this. You have a skill.
Oh yeah,
um
I agree with that.
so
Well,
yeah.
like I do really well in like technology, right? I work in cybersecurity. I'm in this kind of like these micro niches of innovation inside of the security space and everything. And like if people look at like kind of what I've done in my career, like what I've done recently as like the roadmap to my success, and I'm using air quotes here, then you might think that I always had that thing. But I will tell you, I was an idiot. Like I knew nothing about technology when I first started. Like I knew, and it was the hardest thing for me to figure out. Like there was a lot of things about the technology, the stuff that I do on a daily basis now, that just did not come intuitively to me. And it's like the same thing with like master craftsmen, writers, videographers, anybody who pursues mastering a medium or whatever. Like it's not fair to marginalize a person's suffering by seeing what the end result is, or where their current state is, where you find it acceptable or attractive. Yeah, everybody has to start somewhere, and everybody has to explore that. And sometimes in order to solve those problems or the handicaps that people have, you just have to want that thing more and to try to pursue it until like you run it into the grave. Like I want to beat that dead horse until there's nothing left of it, and that's my motivation. I need to know this thing beyond what is probably rational and sane. And at that point, then I feel like maybe I've come to know it, maybe like a few percentage points.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It's actually part of what I like about it is there's no shortcuts. You just need to put in the time. Period. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, you can't like pay your way to the top, right? Like, you have to. I mean, I guess you could, but um, in a more true sense, right? Like theoretical sense. You just got to put in the hours. You got to put in the time, the effort. Um, like you said, sometimes like I see students that like some people just kind of get it quicker than others, but that doesn't take away like the dedication part of it, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that their challenges reside in other areas, right? I mean, some people
Hmm.
understand fundamentals, also have a harder time of being able to break out of it, to explore creativity or self-expression or things like that. And I mean, this it's in trying to understand how people break apart, consume, and metabolize information is in some ways you have to what's the word, create a bias, as it were. But I mean, it's not to marginalize people, but I think that there's lots of different personas of people who learn in different ways, and where one strength or a strength is one thing to one person, it might be a weakness to another. And that's where I think that self growth and that through the arts is very individualized. Like you really have to not focus on what the person beside you is doing, and find a way to really just figure those things out yourself. Because if you're always using somebody else's measuring stick to develop yourself or to define your self worth or whatever, then you're always going to come up short.
For sure. I think that is um, just inaccurate to compare your success to someone else's. But I do use comparing myself to other people at times to motivate me, right? I know it's not always a healthy thing, but I like it when some people keep me accountable, right?
Yeah, I get that.
Um,
I think that's healthy.
yeah.
I think that's healthy, though, right? I mean, I
There's a fine line. There's a fine line. I know it. I know there is because all of a sudden it'll like spin me out, and I'm like, why am I not doing this? And like, oh, I can't keep up with that person or this or that, or they're doing this, and must be nice to be, have those resources and opportunities, and that's kind of stuff like you can totally spin it out. But I also I'm like, hey, like sh- that person got a grant to do this really cool thing. That's cool. Like, let me look at grants that might fund this one project that I want to do, or etc. Right? I like to surround myself with people that are above my skill set, or at. I just like people that I admire, because it's easy to feel awesome when you're surrounded by losers, right? And like I made a conscious choice to curate the people that I spend time with. And it's always people that are like of high caliber, good people, good work ethic, good values, and are just very motivating in different aspects, right? Because it's at this point, yeah, I'm too old to be dealing or wasting time with BS, right?
yeah,
Um,
no, and I get that.
yeah.
I mean, I think that that's true of, well, it should be true. Like at some point in time, you have to realize that people, ideologies and things like that can bring you down, because those people who just like to gripe and complain and make excuses, and they're like this victim mentality. It's not just that it happens to them, but it's also that they pull other people into it. It's like misery loves company is probably the most
Yeah.
true statement ever. And I found that in lives, and it happens in knives too. There's people who are just super negative, and it's like you can't do this and you shouldn't do that, and you have to curate this persona. And I'm just like, I don't know, dude. Like to your point earlier on, it's like, how much do people really care? And I don't mean like the few people that are griping about stuff, but the collective
Yeah.
that, maybe observe, maybe they want to buy your knife. Like, how much do they care about certain things? And it's like, I mean, just focus on you and do your thing and derive the inspiration that you do. And that's the thing I think that people are actually looking for, not how much you're focused on what they see in you.
Right. I mean, the whole reason we're in this game is so that we can follow our own formula. Like, that's the only reason why we're pursuing this is we're doing our own thing, and we want to be our own boss in a certain way. And I feel like that's just kind of inherent in that. So I deeply respect tradition and things like that, but whenever someone asks me if I'm like planning to do like an ABS like math, I'm like, no, I don't need the permission of a bunch of old dudes to make knives. I'm gonna make knives. Like, I'm gonna do it the way that I want. And I have Steve Schwarzer like backing me up, so I don't need much else, right?
Well, yeah. And, I kind of fell into that with getting into the Knife Makers Guild. There was a certain portion, I recognize that validation is a component of creativity, right? I mean, and there's lots of different ways that happens, but there are some ways that you get validation that maybe seem great, but they're maybe in some ways empty. Like, I appreciate the Guild institution, and I appreciate the ABS institution, and there's a lot of really great people within that. But
I agree.
but the thing I'm not thinking about the organization being the thing that I care about. I'm looking for the think tank and the artistic constraints and other things like that it provides. So, like, I'm kind of traveling through this ABS route, and it's mostly just because I want to be able to, apply some rigid constraints that the ABS has against my work, and I want to work in that medium, and I want to do that thing, and I just want to say, okay, like, I can do that thing, and
Right, yeah. I like that it's a challenge, and it's a caliber, right? Like, it's a level playing field, and they're going to check certain things, right? In that regard, for sure. Um like, I appreciate both the guild and ABS. There's other groups and stuff like that that are um I feel it's kind of sad that they're kind of like struggling in a sense. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Abana, um,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, they have this organization, and it's all to be helpful, right? That's like their main intent. And so if you're taking into that approach, I feel like it is helpful. But um, I guess my contrarian side is always at play here.
Well, yeah, but I get that. I mean,
Yeah.
um with Abana or the Guild or anything like that, it just so happens that in blacksmithing and bladesmithing and knife making, we do have some organizations that are, they are the symbol of, perfection's not the right word, but maybe coalescing a skill set or whatever. But it's
Right. It's a certain
yeah,
caliber of work,
but I
right?
mean, there's no like international quilt weavers or quilt makers association type of thing where,
That we know
well,
of.
yeah, maybe underwater basket weaving or something like that. It's kind of like we do have those things, and you get to experience the bureaucracy and politics and them going out of fashion and whatnot in a way that in some other mediums you don't. necessarily get, or you don't have the gatekeeping or things on. I don't know an exceptional amount about glass. Although, like, I can't tell you like how many videos and things like that I've watched, and I've been to a glass blowing seminar and stuff before, but it just seems like mythical to me. Like, I mean, I don't know how it happens, right? It's just like sit there and just admire. I'm like, I could never wrap my head around those things, but I don't. Is there a guild equivalent or an ABS equivalent to glass blowing?
There is in scientific glass, and I'm honestly newer to furnace glass blowing, soft glass. But I know that there is ASGS, the American Scientific Glass Blowing Society, and I have a junior membership to it. And I get the Fusion magazines and I nerd out. And yeah, there is a hierarchy in the politics, and they have a symposium every year in a different city. And there's like the Midwest section and the Southwest section and like stuff like that, right? And it's super nerdy and I love it. Love it so
Yeah,
much. Um, yeah, that's actually how I met my mentor. I volunteered to help at one of those, and yeah, that's where I met. And so yeah, there are things like that. It's such a niche thing, though. The scientific glass. Speaking of dying arts, yeah, like the universities are just kind of like doing away with them and just outsourcing everything, um, which is a shame. But
yeah. I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because oddly enough, like I go to your website and everything, and you actually have your resume on your website, which is, I think, the first time
yeah,
I've ever seen that being done with a craftsman, as it were. Like sometimes portfolios, yes, but an actual resume is interesting to me. And I saw that you were doing scientific glass. It appeared to me, if I remember reading it, about glass used for electron microscopes. Is that correct?
so I was a machinist for electron microscopes. So I made all the pieces and parts and stuff that we would like modify and fix microscopes. So sometimes I would have to remake certain parts on a Bridgeport or a lathe. So that's where the scientific stuff came from. And then I worked for Honeywell UOP in Chicago for a couple summers before COVID obliterated that apprenticeship. Um, and then that actually, because I had the experience with quartz during the pandemic when everything was shut down, I was able to get a job working for the semiconductor industry here in Georgetown. It's not far from here. So I was working on like the biggest machine there. I mean, they're just desperate for anyone that is willing to do that crazy job and anyone who's like familiar with quartz. So with that background, yeah, I was able to still get a job because they were still considered essential. Um, yeah, it was crazy. I don't really post a lot of those videos, but maybe I should. I was thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating because I sometimes it's hard to make inroads. Like if I'm, yeah, again, like you have like a long history of sharing things on social, right, through Instagram, and it's hard to make inroads with like how do you go from this artistic side to the side of machining and working in like more microscopes and doing all that. It's just a completely different avenue of a craft and everything. It's interesting, I think, in a way that just kind of opens your career and experience up like a flower. Like as much as I see online, I'm sure that there are stories behind a lot of these things that you're doing that I would just like spend forever trying to ask you about.
Yeah. a lot of the stuff I wouldn't post for like NDA purposes. Like I could post videos of the process, but not necessarily of the finished apparatus, right? Things like that. So that's limiting me on that. But as far as like the art, it's all the jobs I've taken was in order to still maintain a practice of my own. It's kind of still surprising to me that I get all bent out of shape when I cannot make conceptual sculpture for a long, like, I need to like get stuff out of me. It sounds so cliche, but I do notice the difference when like I'm able to express myself like on an artistic level rather than just spending my entire life in my day to day just collecting a paycheck, so to speak. But all those jobs, ultimately, I was learning a skill that I'm ultimately going to use to um, apply into my art. For example, the electron microscope stuff, I was around a ton of crazy equipment. Like it was really fascinating stuff that I just wouldn't like the instrument that was able to detect how DNA was a double helix, or these crazy old spectrometers that wouldn't work anymore. And I would like get to fiddle around and take them apart, or I had to figure out how to, mostly it was like modifying like the camera portion of those SEMs, the scanning electron microscopes, or how to make the specimen holder for those things are weird because they have like a ruby or a sapphire at the end, um and so it's kind of like this long wand, and there's like this small portion where you put your sample in, and then at the very like right next to it was that like ruby or sapphire that basically has a very minimal coefficient of expansion, right? So it doesn't change much with the different temperatures. Because when you're looking at something through a microscope and you're looking at it like 50,000 times, like kind of like amplifying that magnitude, these little shifts in temperature will completely change what you're looking at. So that's why they would like attach it to a ruby, right? So to prevent that from happening. And there was all these cross references with what like the jewelry and what I was making, and there was always parallels I found. So it kept my interest. It didn't really, I mean, yes, I needed to pay the bills, sure, but I made sure that like all the jobs I took were actually contributing to the final, like ultimately being able to practice sculpture.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get back to that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and like coefficients of friction and expansion and things are like core principles inside of horology, because your movements, if they're affected by like the shifting of temperature or friction or whatever, will actually go out of time. So a timepiece that has more joules actually has a higher tolerance for keeping time and whatnot, right? So like
It's true,
you can see all
yeah,
these like
yeah. Like diamonds, all
yeah.
those dudes, like,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, and well, I think that's something that I actually admire about Steve Schwarzer is that I mean this in the most respectful way, but he always seems like a kid at heart, right? He's like always thirsting
Yeah.
for knowledge and thirsting for this different discipline that helps him think of the world in a different way. And I hope that like I can kind of emulate that in one way or another in my life, where it's just I'm always interested in being able to learn things, because I never know how that's going to apply to the thing that I care about that might be right in front of me, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I agree on both fronts. He's a wonderful. I think that's why we clicked when we met. Um, just nerding out. about different things like that. I think at first sight, it's um, easy to underestimate. Like, I don't think you would have asked about my past without like looking um, at my resume, but it is off something that always comes into play. Like I learned about EDM, like metal cutting through him, and I was fascinated, and he was explaining to me about the process and how that works and how they're able to get such like accurate cuts and things like that. It's easy to kind of get excited about a new process when I think you kind of have to have that attitude to just maintain that magic in the day to day, or else you'll just stuck in this rut of like nihilism, right? Um,
Yeah.
so it's when you find that thing that excites you, or like you get to nerd out about it, and learn more about. I understand how like a spectrometer would be boring to most people, but I don't know. Like, how could you not be fascinated by who figured that out? Is what I want to know.
Yeah.
But
Well, yeah. I mean, like oscilloscopes are kind of like archaic pieces of machinery in their early forms, right? But it's interesting that you get to like through an oscilloscope you can visualize um, electricity, right? You can visualize motion in a way that you just otherwise you have to theorize about it. And there's all sorts of things that if you drill down far enough into the mechanical components of things, you can use instrumentation or whatever to figure out, to be able to visualize things that you just could never articulate in anything other than theory, right? And I think that in some ways that's an interesting play on the natural world. Like something that I see inside of your work are kind of the way that you create things that maybe are like disparate thoughts or whatever, but they have this juxtaposition that is evocative, right? It makes you think about what it is that you're creating. Like I look at some of your stuff and I'm like, it's kind of natural, it's kind of mechanical, it's kind of industrial, right? And I have to sit there and like look at it for a little while and just try to figure it out and see like how I feel about that, and that changes over time too. So I mean, job well done and being able
that's
to be
great.
evocative.
Oh man, that's so great. I'm getting great feedback from you. I hope that it does that. That's like my intent, and all my pieces are like studies for the next thing. It's really funny how it's kind of reaching full circle where I'm like letting my sculpture inform my jewelry, and now I'm at a point where I'm letting my jewelry be little models or maquettes for my larger sculpture that I'm trying to pursue now. Um, but yeah, I'm hoping that it does that. I'm abstract on purpose. I want that piece to be multifaceted. I want it to be more than just like, I don't want to spell it out for anyone either. That's no fun. It's just want it to have an impact, and for the only really thing I want is for people to think. That's it. Just to think about certain phenomenons, or even if like they don't agree or agree, they at least like have that definition. And I know it's not common aesthetic, but yeah, I think it's a fun one for me to explore, and then I love seeing it evolve through other people's eyes. So I'm hoping that will that's my pursuit lately is I'm like shifting back heavily onto the glass for its properties, really. Like, I don't think people realize it's pretty much the only natural material that is transparent. And the only reason for that is because the electrons in the atomic shells are too far apart to jump. So the photons don't get absorbed and refracted back. Um, so it's just like because of that, its refractive properties are really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Like things can seem upside down when they're like when it's thick enough. So yeah, it's just interesting and how the same mechanical properties are in our bodies, even in our eyes. So I use that a lot in my work to kind of make you realize how fascinating like your own body is, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I think it's all really well, it's interesting in the art form, and it's also interesting in the like how you get from place to place, because I like again, like I still don't understand it. Like I what is in glass turning, I know that you can put like a lathe and flame to it, but what is that apparatus that you put in your mouth? Is that to control the rotation of the lathe itself?
no, that'd be cool though. My lathe is variable speed, but essentially that is I have a tube that's going inside of the actual tube of glass. So I can control the pressure in there. If there was nothing there, if I wasn't blowing in there, it glass just wants to be with itself. It'll like it's such a strange material, but it'll like thicken and then it'll like want to be with itself, so it'll constrict if I'm not there like blowing to keep it open.
Oh, that makes sense.
And then the whatever I like if I create a vacuum, it'll kind of implode from the pressure. So it's a very immediate example of like physics, right? What happens, or I think I'm blowing air in there and then something weird is happening and I know that like either my hose got like clogged or twisted up and stuff like that, right? So it's there's all these variables, or maybe my cork fell out and I'm trying to blow and it's not reacting the way that I want. So that tube is just going on the end of it's mostly the drive shaft. Um, and the part on the tailstock is either corked or already like the glass itself is closed off on that end. But if I don't have any kind of, then I can't manipulate the glass if I don't have any air in there. So that's the blowing part of the glass blowing.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I never knew.
Yeah.
I was like it's either something to control something or it's a synthesizer of some sort, like a voice augmenter.
No, that'd be super cool. I know. I think someone thought it was like a camo pack for like booze or water, and I'm like, that would be actually more helpful. But
It's like, why not both? Um, well,
right?
I'm getting into your experience with Steve Schwarzer and everything. I can only assume in some ways that that's had an impact on you and how you create Damascus and everything. Can you talk a little bit more about like your Damascus medium and some of the things that interest you about that?
For sure. I the process because like we did canister. I mean, that's kind of his thing, the mosaic stuff. It was really intuitive for me to learn because I knew how glass cane works. So Marini glass is basically like have a certain color, like combination, and then you like stretch it and pull it out really, really quickly to make a really thin rod. And then you chop up that rod into small coins and flip it on its side so it makes, and then you arrange it on the table and then roll it. Like, so I understood how that process works. It's actually a Venetian technique. Um, that's another fascinating aspect of glass. I find that you can like layer technique on technique on technique, and it's not that's not so much the case. I mean, I guess with like all the experimental Damascus now, it's similar, but in the same way, you are like forging this specific arrangement of different steels and then like drawing it out, cutting it up, rewelding it, stacking it, doing all that. Um, it was like, oh, duh, like, it's exactly the same thing, right? So it was, of course, there's like nuances for doing it correctly without any like delamination and all that. But yeah, it's cool. It was also cool to see his like the tools that he made. Because I don't, yeah, no one taught him. He just figured it all out. He's like one of those geniuses, right? And that actually, it made me just want to make more pieces. I don't have a 300-pound Chambersburg. I would love to have one, I guess, in theory. um, but I only do Damascus when I have like the press and like the capacity. I would borrow my friend's shops in Chicago to make some things like that. And every now and then, the guys from Austin Metal Authority, I'll kick it with them and make some. But I mostly just didn't want to make a knife with whatever I made. I would use components in my sculptures. Um, and some people even gift me Damascus to like as in a collaborative effort. Um, Nick Ange is one of them, who's a regular person who sends me just all the random stuff he doesn't want. Um, and I feel like our aesthetics align a little bit. So it's been fun to add a little different energy of the different Damascus and styles. I'm still working on a Jason Morrissey Hidden Tang at the moment, but I feel like I haven't had that much time in my own shop lately, but I'll get it done soon.
uh,
I have plans.
I get that. Like, I have a bunch of like pet projects to real projects that I have to get done, and I always find that there's something else that takes precedence over it, like working or taking care of kids or things like that. So, I mean, I get that
Yeah.
entirely, but I'm interested. So you're in Austin area. How integrated are you into like the collective Texas knife making scene? Because I guess maybe when I was originally talking to Steve and we were talking about your art form and everything, I didn't realize how like close in proximity we were. But do you mostly focus on I guess the industry and the shops and the equipment and stuff like that you have available to you based on kind of like your circle, or are you familiar with like all the different knife makers and the Texas Knife Makers Guild in that area that you're around in there?
I approach that the same way I do the fine art world, and which means I keep to myself. Um, like I've run a gallery, and I I've done all the things. So I've been like plugged in and then like stepped away. And so I think since the pandemic, I've just been like, this is my bubble, and I'm gonna keep it that way. So I'm not super. In fact, I network more when I'm around like someone like Neil Kimimura. Um, and actually, you interviewed Brian from
Hmm,
Keenness and
yeah.
Knives. Like, I'm tight with him. He'll like is so grateful that he'll let me borrow his sandblasters randomly or whatever machinery they have. So I'll swing through there on a random occasion. They're great, great dudes. Love them. And so, yeah, I kind of stick within my circle. I know that there's a lot of really great knife makers. I was really close with Hatcher Knives. I haven't really seen him post anything lately. Um, but yeah, I think it's mostly um, just the Instagram community I'm like closer with, like Joshua Prince and Mareko and people like that that are afar, but we're very close still. And I know that I'm like very, um, I know there's a lot of knife makers here, even in the Austin area that I'm familiar with. But that's because I work and go home, and I'm a hermit. So
Yeah, it's actually funny. I think that um, COVID kind of taught me to love silence, whereas like I think social interaction whatnot was a lot. It was kind of like more like a duty, I guess. But like since pandemic times, I've actually become a lot more comfortable with like not going out. And then the older I get, the more of a curmudgeon I get about spending money. So it's like if it's
yeah,
like low cost or there's like a low barrier of entry and I can have fun or it's interesting to me, that I'm all about that. But if it's like a lot of people or costs a lot of money, I'm a little bit less apt to do it. But no, I also get I get the connection that you can make with other artists that might not share the same aesthetic necessarily, but share the same appreciation for the craft. And I don't mean just in knives, but I mean in like trying to look at this sphere, right, and see how what makes it tick, and they do that in their own medium. I've listened to Mareko for forever. I've watched Neil Kamimura. Had an opportunity to meet him, but kiddo was in the hospital, so I didn't. But I've really loved like kind of what he's done with within knives over the years, and he just seems like a really great guy too. Brian with Keenis and Knives. I think it's interesting because I definitely can see where you guys would be friends because the way that he thinks about design as an industrial designer and then applying some of those things into his knives seems not that it makes
they're
yeah
beautiful. They're so
yeah in
beautiful.
a way that I can't always say that the knife pattern or things like that is what you'd consider traditional in any way, but there's just always something that I'm looking at in it that I can find pleasure with. I guess he just makes a lot of eye candy, but they're functional art, but
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
and
I agree.
and what
So
yeah,
clean.
and I look at your work too, and I have to think, right, that when I see certain elements of like your knives specifically, that there is a purpose for it, right, and that it's you find with some knife makers that things just happen because they're supposed to happen. Like these pins are placed somewhere where they should be placed, or this this has a specific contour or facet because that just is the way it is. But when I look at yours, it is a little bit more thought provoking in that way because there's a way that you present ideas within knives that I wouldn't expect it to be there, right? Like some of
Mhm.
your stone insertions and things like that into handles, or some of the geometrics of your guards and stuff that you've done. To me, is interesting, and it makes me think a little bit more outside the box about what what does smooth lines really mean versus geometric lines, and what is the juxtaposition between hard lines and soft lines and curvatures and stuff. So, I mean, it's always something that I think about.
Yeah, I think it was just my like I was actually really inspired by Michael West and how he's really not a knife maker, he's a jeweler. He's making hollow forms in his inlays. I don't know, his forms are just beautiful. His lines are very, very thought out and honestly minimal. It's a very minimalist thing, but I saw him make like a mirrored silver sheath. That guy. And I was like, man, I love making hollow forms. Like, why am I not throwing more of my jewelry skills in my work and making it more challenging and more fun for me? And like, I learned a lot in the process. But yeah, like, why not culminate all these skills that I have and not just offer one, but a multitude? So like the new project I'm working on are tattoo machines, and we're gonna like make them like jewelry level machines, right? Just for fun. Um, and so I love these collaborations where you can actually use the best of both minds, right? I always appreciate like Bryant McKeenison. His lines are very sculptural, not only functional, but yeah. So it's just kind of cool to see both of those energies collide in one piece,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Well, I'm also, like you mentioned about Joshua Prince and everything, and man, some of what he does boggles the mind to me. Um, like the mosaics and everything like that, and the way that he thinks about like handle design and whatnot. It's I guess
I love
yeah,
it.
it's in the
Yeah,
same world. Like it's not wacky because it's like it's incredibly abstract, but it takes some portion of what you would probably consider normal or traditional, and it just turns it on its head. And it says like you know you're looking at me because in on the surface I might seem normal, but the more you dig into like the aesthetic and some of those like the nuances of what he does, it's just like very not normal. It's very like there's chaos in simplicity. There is I guess things that I would not expect to be part of the material flow. And like to me, I look at that. I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know. Like to me, I like evocative things. I don't know. Like maybe it is a contrarian
yeah,
like thing, but I like things that make me either think there's a portion of me that might hate it, but I don't know why. It's like like ASMR or whatever, where some people listen to it and it just like is like nails on a chalkboard, and for others it's very
right,
soothing. And like I like those things because it makes me think about it. I'm like, man, the more I look at that thing, the more I just like I don't know why I want to have it, but I do.
right. It actually parallels his personality quite elegantly, because he's very zen and very calm in the way he talks, but he's actually really punk rock at the same time. Like he's very also when I see him making like like his Damascus, I got to see him and Leah collaborate. Uh, it was he was like a madman, and then but he's like has his espresso machine, and he's like very calm, but he's also like he'll say something that's like out of left field, and I didn't realize how incredibly like he comes from this kind of more like punk rock lifestyle. So a sliver. I've only spent like a minimal amount of time with him, but I feel like I've known him for decades. But so you can kind of see that kind of like elegance, and then also like thing coming out of left field. Like, did I just? Is that really what he did? And I'm like, oh my god, he did do that, right? So it's really cool. It's what I want to see. I want to see more of that. Just kind of unique creativity, really. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember before we like hit the record button, I was talking about like if we just talk to each other or people and we just talk about I don't know knives all the time, it really kind of becomes a little bit boring in some ways because like there are different ways that you can iterate on knives, but what's interesting is about what causes somebody to make a knife or what is the behind the scenes to that creation. Like like Prince, the idea of like that punk rock scene and the juxtaposition with his personality and everything, to me makes him infinitely more fascinating than even just his knives. And they're fascinating, in and of themselves. But like, if you listen to like, if you listen to a person on a podcast, how many times can you listen to them on a podcast before you kind of know superficially like everything that they, wish to present to somebody? Um, I'm way more fascinated with like what drives people than what they actually create, even though that is a separate level of fascination for me.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100%. It's when I see like, oh, what, when students come to me and are like, well, what should I do? And I'm like, that's up to you. You're the designer, like what I should like it to look like this, right? I'm like, look, this is what's traditional, but what do you want? Right? So I see there's some people that have a trouble finding their own voice. And while it does take practice, just like it's like a muscle that needs to be exercised, right? To kind of decide what you like. There are people that just go around like doing as they're told, and just floating through life, and doing something they hate, but they're just doing it because they think they're supposed to. And while at times there's value in that, I the whole point of being on this planet is to see those nuances, like celebrating each other's differences and their ingenuity and what they can bring, right? Like I just want to see all the individuality. Yeah, like we're all humans and going through it, but I'm like, how do you deal with it? And it's a spectacle, and it's surprising every time,
Yeah,
right? um so like that's what's so fascinating to me, like you said, right?
yeah. Well, and I mean, people, I think in general can bore you if they're all just doing the same exact thing, and that's maybe there's a
Yeah, or also this attitude of because you think different of me, then it's like, and they reject it, right? And I feel like that's actually something that should be celebrated instead. um
oh yeah. Well, I mean, and man, I have to think that there are, it's not just knives. It's just like societal or human condition things. But imagine all the exceptionally brilliant people that never were because somebody decided to proverbially shit in their Cheerios, right?
yeah,
And I think about that in knives so often because like, man, I don't know, when you sit kind of like on this periphery that I do, where I'm interested in the research side of different mediums and things, right? I see that there are a lot of knife makers that the ego, um, maybe unintentionally so, drives people to conformity, right? That this is the way that you do things. This is what is expected of you. This is what is the success factor, right? So how many knives you sell, or whether you're published all the time, or whether you are in a certain group or clique or whatever. And I do think part of the podcast is to talk to a lot of different people about their vantage point within knives, and it's mostly just so that if one knife maker or one person who is thinking about creativity or self-expression or whatever can hear that thing and change, like pivot and change their own paradigm into something where they're like, hey, you know what, I might have been convinced to conformity, but I'm really want to do this really unique thing, and this encourages me. I think that I've done like the kind of service that I want to, because I think it is in that contrarian sense where I really just dislike when people tell me no and I can't do something. Like my entire life has been about deucing people and saying, I'm going to do what I want in the time that I want, and maybe it's going to be like infinitely harder for me to do it, but I am willing to capitalize on that by the experience that I gain from it.
yeah, yeah. That's a good way, a very beautiful way of putting that. yeah, I think there's a lot of self-discovery and just questioning why, right? Why you're doing certain things. I think you're right that certain egos have a set way of doing things. Certain egos actually do exactly what you're saying. I think sometimes that can be like, I'm actually on purpose going to do, like, drives them to go against the grain. Um, but yeah, I think it's a learning process regardless. Yeah, I think you put it in a really great way. But yeah, I'm very selfish with my time nowadays. So um, yeah, I'm going to spend my time the way that I want to.
Yeah. Well, so
Life is
yeah.
short. Life is really
So
short.
how do you operate out of your own shop? Like I'm trying to like kind of envision what how exactly you work exactly, because you know obviously you have different mediums that you work in fairly regularly, as it were. But you know, so it's like day job, and then you have your own shop to do stuff in, or kind of how does that work out for you? Like how do you organize these different areas that you play in?
That's a great question, actually. I I've been teaching at two different jewelry schools. I've been teaching at one for over 10 years and ACC since the pandemic. And then I work for Ghost Pepper Glass part-time. They're the furnace glass blowing. So that's something, man, it is so uh, interesting to be in a space where you suck at something. Like I'm better at the scientific glass, but I'm not trained as a traditional furnace glass blower. So I'm like going through those growing pains. But anyway, I work for them part time. Getting trained up to teach them the public on different classes there. And then I have my shop on the east side. So in the past year or so, I've like leaned down the amount of custom knife orders. So I'm not actually currently taking any. I'm just finishing up the fun collaborative ones that are on my bench, and also just my own production line. Um, so maybe the amount of time I spend in my own shop is a little less. However, it is mostly just to, I have a lot of like dream projects on the line, and I'm trying to get them all organized. So like clients that want pieces for their homes and or like tattoo shop or whatever it may be. I have a few free reign sculpture projects and with the client. So that's like ideal. That's what I want to do. So I'm in the middle of using both technology to make my process in my shop more efficient. And yeah, I'm trying to also, yeah, so I already have, I build like inventory of jewelry throughout the year. So like while I'm teaching and stuff, I'll like get there early or whatever and like make my own work. So that's kind of how I split my time. If I'm going to be teaching jewelry, I'll try to make the most efficient use of my time and make jewelry there. And then, um, yeah, so then when I'm doing glass, I'm thinking about what conceptual pieces I want to make with that medium and practice that on my off time, because that's another great thing is having access to that studio and someone to assist you. It's a complicated and complex skill set, and you need, that's another thing I'm not used to, is you need to be in a team. Like you need someone else to be able to make work. So we trade assisting time. So I assist someone and then they assist me. So that's been a very fun and like humbling pursuit. But yeah, that's kind of how I split my time. When I'm at the glass shop, I'll try to prototype. If I'm in jewelry land, I'm going to try to make that. If I'm in my shop, I'll glue up some handles and then work on this other stuff, right? But yeah, it's not the most traditional way of life, but
Well, I I kind of like have thought about that. I don't know how I could personally do something like that. Like I'm really fascinated with leather work, right? I suck at it. Like I think it's like if I was repetitious enough about it, I could get good at it, right? But I totally suck at it. And but I've thought about like if I divide my time between all of these things that I really like to do. Like, I mean, I do like jewelry work. I've thought about like adding in some equipment so that way I could do like jewelry type of products or projects. I love lapidary. I've never actually gotten into stone grinding or things like that, but it's like really fascinating to me.
very similar to grinding a knife, just wet,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, yeah, but I mean,
That's it.
like the space requirement. It's like I can't have a shop that has like absolutely everything that I like to do because I am kind of limited
Oof,
on
yeah.
space. I'd like to do blacksmithing. Like I could just see if I took half of the knife making equipment that I have that's related to machining out and I put in equipment instead that was for blacksmithing, I could do knife making and blacksmithing. But I really do like the precision of machining stuff. So I kind of have to like pick and choose. Otherwise, I just have a humongous building of all of these things that allow me to like kind of like poke around. But how does that work with like the kind of glass that you want to make and everything and the foundry stuff that you do? I mean, like you'd have to have an infinitely large shop to be able to house all the stuff that you would need for that, right?
Right. Yes. I ideally that would be the case, but I do not have that. I have basically the equivalent of a two-car garage. And I get this question a lot with my students. I don't invest in much jewelry stuff because I have access to that. I also have access to ACC Riverside. The Austin Community College, the same college I work for, has this incredible welding department with 5 power hammers, 3 huge forges, and all the welding equipment I could ever want. So I don't ever intend on buying a power hammer. I just, every now and then, I'm really tight with all the instructors there, and they let me, I respectfully, like, walk in there and be like, hey, I just need to work on this one thing or bust this thing out. And typically they have the same attitude I do when I'm teaching. Like, I want people to be in there working. Like, that's what it's for, right? So I basically have the flame working scientific glass stuff in there and some like the knife stuff in there. And yeah, I'm able to kind of, it's not ideal to be in such a dusty environment with all the glass, but I make it work. I'm like very, um, I keep it clean. I cover up my lathe. I cover up my torch so dust doesn't get in there. I like have to do a bunch of prep regardless of cleaning the glass before I work on anything. So I'm just kind of very methodical. I'm, uh, you know, not trying to blow glass on the same day I'm grinding handles, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I hate that.
So
Well, I mean, not blowing
yeah,
glass, but
it's,
grinding stuff. I'm just like, oh god, I got to clean up the entire garage because it just gets everywhere.
but yeah, that's the thing. You're committed to, that's basically your life. You're making dust. Like that's how you make a living is you make dust. It's pretty silly, but when you think about it. But yeah, I'm just, I guess, more intentful. And like you said, the priorities shift a lot. So I have to be very organized with the projects and what takes precedence, like you said.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested. You mentioned about this tattooing collaboration stuff. Like, what exactly is it that you're doing? Are you machining and creating tattoo guns, or what? Can you describe a little bit more about that to me?
Um, yeah, sure, of course. I am collaborating with someone on like I'm actually doing the CAD for this machine. This Yeah, and then just making all the parts. So I'm not unfamiliar with this, just like kind of I have these constraints that there's certain geometries that need to be considered, and like there's a lot of little parts and hardware to go onto these motors, and I'm gonna eventually, like, I have to solder all the motors in, and basically designing all the parts and getting them manufactured. And we're doing them out of the first run out of brass, and so eventually we can like plate them or add jewelry and all different kinds of that's the plan, at least, variations on this, but it's basically like the most tried and true type of machine. And I feel like it aligns so much with what I'm already doing and the jewelry. Like, I think tattoos um, are basically a permanent heirloom of sorts, right? And I'm just excited to make a tool that's gonna, like, I don't know, they mean a lot to me on my, like, I know it doesn't always to some people. It means something different. And I'm all about you do you. But I found a really a transformative thing with them. And so it's really exciting to be making something that's going to contribute to that. So essentially, yeah, I catted up this thing and we made a few prototypes, and now we're just going to make some small limited runs. Um, with I'm partnering with Dylan Forte. He's has a reputation in a lot of like the sacred geometry type stuff, so our artwork alone like kind of aesthetically aligns. And he's out here in Wimberley, so it's just been fun kind of working on this project with him, and I'm learning how to solder a bunch of stuff. Well, I know how to solder jewelry, but soldering like electrical things is pretty fun.
And frustrating at times. But yeah,
Yeah, I'm
it's kind of
sure. Yeah.
interesting. Like I see a little bit more of a parallel in tattoos and knives and, well, in art, than I guess maybe you used to. But it's interesting to me because, like, my wife and I, well, I haven't got any tattoos lately, but there's like, I like them because there's a catharsis, I think, to getting tattoos and being willing to commit to something on your skin that in a lot of other avenues in life, you might not commit to those things, right? But then you get to like wear this thing, and and it's just like a little breadcrumb to maybe something internally that you are fascinated with, or a component of self expression, right? And that's the way that I've always looked at tattoos. I'm not like trying to convey like being a tough guy or things like that. I really like it for the art and
No.
expression component of it. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that through this, um, you know, tattooing component that you appreciate and you commit to yourself, that you're actually making tattoo guns. Like, to me, that's like rad. It's like um, I saw it, this is tangential, but I've always grown up around harmonicas. Just it's weird.
Hmm.
Maybe it's an Appalachian thing too, but like folk music and stuff. But
Yeah.
there's only one example of a person who makes harmonicas by hands that I am aware of, and they're somewhere in the UK. I saw some like random YouTube video about it, and this guy has made all of his own tools to take like what would traditionally only happen in a factory setting and make them himself an artisan harmonica craft. And to me, that kind of thing is super rad. Like the same thing I think about with like tattoo guns, like being able to like make those things and make them beautiful and they're functional, and it's in a, like this, you know, an artisan or bespoke type of manner. To me, is like interesting in and of itself, regardless of the other stuff that you do. So I'm like, congratulations in finding another avenue of self expression that's like really rad.
Thanks. I'm really excited about this. I deeply care about this. It's another kind of counterculture that I've had the luxury of kind of dipping into. And the person who does the artwork on my body has been one of like my like art heroes. I don't know. I just was always obsessed with his work, and the fact that he's the one that like really like kind of got me started on it. He knew I made knives, and I actually gave him one as part of a tip, and like he just wanted me to make some back plates to a machine and as a trade. So a lot, like most of my work has been in through trade with him. But yeah, it's something so primal. I found it so when I'm like kind of reading up on the history of jewelry, it inevitably comes up as well. Like all this, it's a universal cultural tribal thing that is super innate, and I think you're totally hit the nail on the head with the catharsis thing, because it is. I mean, it's a lot to go through, and then there's like an adjustment period too with like having it on your body. Now I see pictures of myself without them, and I'm like, that looks so weird. Like, I feel like I should have had these like all along. But yeah, it's really it's been a fun venture and something I really have faith in. So it's been
Yeah,
cool.
um in tattoos, I've gotten stuff on my body that like means stuff to me, right? And it's kind of like a patchwork of just different things. In some ways, I think like maybe if I would have thought a little bit more intentionally about things, that maybe the placement of stuff and how it all ties together would be a little bit different, because it really doesn't. Like I don't have anything that really ties together, and so it's more of like a billboard for different things that I experience or appreciate. And I've noticed like on your tattoos and stuff, like it seems like in some ways that they're very intentional. That there's maybe not that that's the way that it was intended walking into it, but the concept is all like, you know, the geometrics and the placement and everything seems kind of that way. Do you appreciate the fact that you went that route of like doing art through like tattoos versus the randomized tattooing like I have?
Yeah, totally. I'm glad I waited as long as I did. Um to really like go. I mean, because you get all these impulses when you're younger, but surprisingly, I have like a multitude of different artists that tattoo me, but they all have align with my aesthetic, and so I kind of just give them certain cues, and I think it's important to let them have a lot of creative freedom in it. Um, there's only a few on my like a handful of them on my body that I like added to later on that I designed myself. Um, but ultimately, it's always like, here's my artwork, you take your spin on it, and in that sense, it's been very exciting to me. But yeah, I do. What fascinated me when I started really diving deep into the tattoo culture were the bodysuits. And I just felt like it made more sense to go that route instead of just a bunch of like little even though I do like the aesthetic of like traditional, having like a lot of stamps or whatever. Like, stamps is not the right word. People are gonna like hate me for that, but you know what I mean? Like, just like a lot of random things. I do like, especially like the old black work Russian tattoos. I think they look really, really cool. And even just like the history of them and like the symbolism is all really heavy. But the ones that would just floor me were always these crazy bodysuits that take so much dedication. Um, and yeah, it's kind of fascinating how people just go all in, right? And it just makes sense to me as like a canvas. And a lot of my work is like this a lot too. That's symmetrical and but not exactly the same. So even though it may look like the placement is the same, but if you take another deeper look, they're like different designs. So it's like parallels my conceptual work.
Yeah. Well, and I guess like in that way, if real estate on your skin and everything is a canvas or a portion of something, you kind of ruin is the wrong word, but I mean, I can't tell you how many like tattoo artist buddies I have that have basically go through removal processes to be able to put something else in its place once they think through kind of like architecturally how they want to do things. Like, so some people that sit in tattoo parlors all the time that just get little cool stuff that their budget allows. And then others that spend thousands of dollars on this piece that they fill out on their canvas that really has a lot more intention and thought and structure to it. Maybe even in the context of it flowing or not being the same. Like, I mean, like sacred geometry, I think, is one of those things where there's a lot of beauty and repetition, but then there's also a lot of dynamic shifts that you can have in the way that you look through things geometrically, even on your body and whatnot. And like, to me, that's again,
It's hard to
yeah,
do too on a soft skinned body, like something so calculated on a round surface is hard. You know, I'm fortunate that like the people that I've been with like understand that very well. Um, but yeah, it's um the Thomas Hooper is the one that is like my main guy that I go to, and I think he popularized all that mandala black work, like dot work stuff, right? The super subtle things. So and Dylan's known for that as well, and so the machine we're making is capable of doing all of it, really. Um, it's kind of interesting to compare different machines side to side, but yeah, so it's the sacred geometry has like kind of just resonates with a lot of people due to, I don't know, the kind of, I don't want to use this word, but the godliness of math in nature, right? It's um, kind of a powerful idea and something that kind of rules over our lives, whether we realize it or not. But it's all math,
yeah.
right?
Well, yeah, I
So
mean, I think that like the golden ratios and Fibonacci sequences and numerology and things like that have, for a long time, fascinated and mystified people, right? And no, I agree. Like, I think there are things like principles in physics and principles in nature that if if we try if we try to measure them or calculate them, they behave one way, but we understand that behind our backs they behave a different way. It's kind of like quantum mechanics and things like that, right? And I think that
Yeah.
there is this really fascinating component of things being orderly and yet chaotic. That it makes sense in one context, but is totally like chaotic or destructive in another way. And I'm interested to see, like, I'm always interested to see artists explore that. But especially in knives, man, there's like 99% of knife making is chaotic. There's nothing that is really so precise that you don't start off with chaos. You're just refining something and using an exorbitant amount of energy to try to make something that seems perfect, but really, if you look close enough, it's not ever that way. And so I think that's probably like one of the neurotic components of knife making and craft in general is just trying to make something perfect, knowing that you'll never actually get there.
Man, you just put it in the most eloquent way. I really like that. Yeah, it is. It is just this obsessive, like, hand sanding nonsense. Like, know, it makes no sense. But I think that's what um, I also appreciate about it. It's each one is like a fight on its own, right? Um, just to like put order to that chaos. And I maybe like that, and I feel that that friction is is healthy. Yeah.
I don't think that I don't think that it can be overstated. I think that it is healthy. It is healthy to uh, take a walk on the wild side, as it were, to be able to get right up against the mountain that you're about to climb and figure out exactly what it is, versus just like dreaming about things or whatever apprehensions people have. Like, you have to be willing to do things, and you have to be willing to. I think it really comes down to being okay with being vulnerable towards life, right? Because like we try to psych
Right.
ourselves out that like we're tough enough to like get out of a knife fight or something like that, or we're able to walk away from bad relationships, or we're able to learn anything, or whatever these things are. We like psych ourselves out, but in reality, I think like people in general are scared to live in that edge of like people who ride motorcycles. I've always appreciated that, although we lost our son in a motorcycle accident, right? I appreciate the fact that bikers live in this space of like life and death are part of the same circle, right? And
Yeah.
creativity and living life is all part of the same circle. Death is a part of life, right? And creativity is a part of failing and one portion of you dying, whether it's like expectations or hope in certain things, and then another thing taking over and allowing you to create, right? And it's that spark. Like, as long as you have spirit, as long as you have life, you always have the ability to create those things. And if more people were vulnerable to that fact, I think that we'd see like more creativity, like more people that are not afraid to fail, but are just like go out off headlong into a problem or a certain idea and create things. And to me, that's like a fascinating world to live in.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I like to fail fast. So I know,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
It's like rip the
It's
band-aid.
almost
Yeah,
masochistic, But yeah, it's for me it drives purpose. Like you said, it's a lot more meaningful life to live. Um, I mean, that's just part of it. And I think you just get, like you said, used to it and then like roll with the punches. Like now you're like ready for other struggles to come along, because you know you can deal with them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, I,
Um,
I agree.
yeah.
But, I definitely, I'm going to continue to always keep an eye on your work and appreciate your art form and everything like that. I mean, it's I know that in the world of having to like earn a paycheck and stuff, you probably have to get back to it. But you know, when you come up with interesting stuff, or you are interested in talking about like subcomponents of art form and whatnot, I'm more than happy to have you on the podcast again, because I think that's something that we could spend a lot more time decoupling, right? Instead of talking about this amalgam of who you are through this length of time that you've been experiencing art and craft, to be able to focus on like very specific components of what you do, because I mean, man, it appears to me at least that you've lived multiple lifetimes, and gained a lot of experience.
Certainly feels like it.
But that's cool, right? I mean, there's lots of stuff to talk about. It's just like you gotta be able to take the time and talk about that stuff. And I think that that's an inspiration to other people, because you'll never know how much you can learn until you try. But when you try, you'll always learn that you really don't know a whole lot about anything. And and
Yeah.
I like talking to people who get to that paradigm where they're like, man, as much as I think maybe I know, I really know nothing. And I'm like, okay, that's a great conversation.
The more I know, the more I know I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
know.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. It's something that Steve and I were on the same page about, and he was right about you. You're smart cookie. So yeah, it would be my pleasure. This was really, really awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is a pleasure to
I
be.
could talk about nerdy stuff all the time. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Well, welcome back anytime. I'll keep an eye on you. If you need anything, let me know. And it's been an incredible pleasure to have you on and talk to you.
Awesome. Great, Aaron. Have a great night.
You too. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.